All right. Hello and welcome, everyone. We'll give everybody just a second to file in. But before we get started, I wanted to let you know that this program will be recorded and will be available on the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum YouTube channel after this presentation. Give it 1 minute and then we will get started. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Melissa Keevy. I am the executive director at the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum, and I want to welcome you. Man, I am tongue-tied this morning, so sorry. Welcome you to our virtual series, History in Focus. History in Focus explores relevant historic topics in Upper Manhattan and the surrounding areas. We would like to thank the Honorable Carmen De La Rosa, New York City Council District 10, for her support of this program. During the lecture, if you have any questions for the speaker, please use the Q&A function, and we will answer those questions at the end. This afternoon, we are joined by Dr. Tyler Anbinder, a professor of history at George Washington University with a specialization in 19th century America and the history of immigration and ethnicity in American life. Today, Dr. Anbinder will discuss his new book, Plentiful Country, The Great Potato Famine and the Making of Irish New York. Dr. Anbinder's book is a great resource that upends what we thought we knew about the famine and the Irish people in New York and beyond. I'm particularly excited to hear about this as our neighborhood used to be predominantly Irish, and I think this will really illuminate some of the history of our own neighborhood. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Dr. Tyler Anbinder.
Thanks so much. And I'm delighted to get a chance to talk to folks at the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum. What I'm going to do is share my screen here so that you can see my slides. And we go like this. And I think this works. And then we go to a slideshow from start. Okay. Melissa, does that look good?
It's perfect.
Great. All right. So what I'm going to talk about today is kind of sum up my recent book on the famine Irish immigrants and the lives they made in New York City. And the book came out last year, and as Melissa said, the thesis of the book is that we've underestimated the famine Irish in New York. And I'll show you some slides to give you a sense of why I mean this. So this is a photo I took of a recreated famine era cabin in the very southwest corner of Ireland. And that if you look at that inset map on the bottom left, that gray area on the bottom left of Ireland, that's where this cabin is. It's in County Kerry. It's on a 100 square mile estate that was known back in the famine era, so that's the 1840s and 1850s, as the Lansdowne Estate. And it was called the Lansdowne Estate because the whole 100 square miles was owned by the Marquis of Lansdowne, an English aristocrat who, at that point, at the beginning of the famine, was the Chancellor of the Exchequer. So he's a wealthy Englishman, and he owns this huge estate that he got because one of his ancestors 200 years earlier had helped the English monarchs subdue Ireland in their war of conquest there. And so the Marquis of Lansdowne lives this very wealthy life in both London and in a big mansion in southern England. And his wealth comes from the rents that are paid by people like the people who lived in this cabin you're seeing here. And there are thousands of people who live in cabins like this all across the estate. And there are thousands of rent payments uh, created the lifestyle that the Marquis of Lansdowne enjoyed. At the beginning of the book, I focus on two of the immigrants who come from this estate, one whose name was John Lane and the other whose name was Dennis Sullivan. They both live on the estate, so they would have lived in cabins like this, in a scenery like this. They both come to New York during the famine. Um, Probably both come because the Marquis of Lansdowne paid for thousands of his indigent tenants to come to America. And the reason he did this was because his estate agent said to him, the guy who collected the rent said, this is really not going well. The British government is requiring landowners to pay to keep their starving tenants in the poorhouse. And it would cost a lot less just to ship some of them to America rather than keep paying for them to live in the poorhouse. And that's where you would go when you literally ran out of food and money and had no other way to survive. So Sullivan and Lane come to New York, as I said, probably both with the help of their landlord, and they end up living in Five Points. Five Points is the neighborhood that was located where now kind of Chinatown meets the courthouse district in Lower Manhattan. I've got a little inset map of that here. So it was called Five Points because there was this five-cornered intersection here. And right here now is the Moynihan Courthouse. So if those of you have been downtown, some of the famous federal trials that go on take place right here. But the Lansdowne immigrants tended to settle right around the Five Points intersection. And we know from records I'll describe in a second that John Lane ends up living in this big brick tenement at 31 Baxter Street, which is right here. And then Dennis Sullivan lives catty corner across the street over here in this building, 6 Little Water Street. And the two of them initially have very similar lives. They come to New York in the early 1850s. They both start working as day laborers. And they do that for the first several years that they live there, living in these tenements that are some of the worst in New York. But from that point on, their lives diverge. Sullivan stays in the neighborhood, in fact, moves over to Baxter Street, where Lane is, and lives there for the next 30 years of his life and works as a day laborer until he dies in the 1880s. John Lane, on the other hand, eventually opened a saloon right here in his tenement at 31 Baxter Street, and then eventually moved it across the street to several locations on Baxter Street. And then in the mid-1860s, he saved enough money in his account at the Emigrant Savings Bank that he was able to move uptown and buy a tenement. And in this tenement that he bought uptown on the west side in the West 20s, he rented out apartments to other immigrants, and then he ran a saloon on the ground floor of the tenement. And eventually he made so much money as a landlord that he figured, I don't have to work anymore. And so in his mid-40s, he stopped running the saloon. He rented it out to someone else and just lived on the profits of his tenement rents. And so you have two very divergent stories there. John Lane, who essentially strikes it rich in America. He dies a quite comfortably well-off man. And Dennis Sullivan, who stays relatively poor, working as a day laborer his entire life in America. And so the question has been, which story is more common? Was John Lane an exception or not? And the way historians have always written about the famine immigrants was that the John Lanes were very much the exception, and that most famine immigrants who came to America were like Dennis Sullivan. And because of a lack of money they could bring with them to America, a lack of education, because of discrimination, that they were basically stuck at the bottom of America's socioeconomic ladder for their whole lives. And yet at the time that John Lane and Dennis Sullivan lived, Americans tended to portray the situation this way. They tended to portray it as this poster here on the left shows it with you leave your cabin in Ireland and then you get to America, and a couple of decades later, you're sitting there at a white linen tablecloth and you have servants serving you. So when I started writing about this book about the Famine Irish in New York, I assumed that the Dennis Sullivan's story must be the way that most of them lived. That was the way that historians had always told it, despite the fact that at the time, the immigrants painted a much rosier picture of their prospects in America. The way historians told it, the famine Irish men were stuck in these unskilled jobs. And so I'm showing you a couple of them here on the screen. You've got on the left a day laborer working on a construction site. That's a hod he has on his shoulder, and he's carrying the hod full of mortar up the rickety ladder for the masons who are putting up the brick walls of a tenement or some other building. And you see there in the background behind him, there's another day laborer carrying the bricks. Other jobs you could do as an unskilled worker might be as a porter, like this guy carrying this trunk at the water side, or these people down on the bottom right working in a gas plant who are shoveling coal into big furnaces to create the gas that lit the gas lights of New York City. And then in the upper right, you can see a peddler who's roaming the streets selling used hats. And yet it struck me that when you looked at the time period that we're talking about, the 1850s and 60s, the Irish told their story differently than today's historians. They said, we have lots of opportunity in America, and we often do quite well. So here's some images. These are kind of trading cards. I have no idea why you would make trading cards like this, but these are from the period we're talking about. And as you can see here on the upper left, there's Paddy O'Rourke when he arrives in America. There he is in his second year on the ladder, working as a day laborer on a construction site. But there he is in year 5, further to the right, he's become a policeman. And by year 10, according to these trading cards, he's become, he's a saloon keeper, and he's also a politician. And so that was the kind of way that the Irish rise up the ladder was portrayed in the era. And here's a letter below that tells the same kind of story. It might be hard for you to read, so I'll read it to you. Starting at the top left, it says, "This is the best country in the world. There is no want," meaning no poverty. And then he goes on to say, "But they must work for it and very hard right now." Now you might wonder, why is the writing going in two directions? Well, this Irish immigrant, who himself was someone who had worked his way up to being a saloon keeper and a politician, nonetheless felt was such a penny pincher that when he was writing a letter back home to Ireland, rather than use 2 pieces of paper, he filled the piece of paper writing in one direction, and then he turned the paper 90 degrees and wrote some more across, so that way he could save money. And as we'll talk about later, I think that's one of the reasons the famine Irish do so much better than people imagined. So the problem with figuring out whether the story that the historians told of people, of Irish famine immigrants locked in poverty, or the story that the famine Irish often told of themselves at the period, back in that period, the reason the historians have never been able to come up with evidence one way or the other that was really solid was because it was impossible to track the famine Irish and see what became of them in any significant numbers, right? You might know the story of a John Lane or a Dennis Sullivan, but you need thousands of those to know what the patterns were, what the trends were, what was common and what wasn't. But what I did with my book, and the reason I actually wrote it, was because of the opening of these records that you can see here on the screen. These are the records of the Emigrant Savings Bank. For those of you in New York, you probably know that the Emigrant Savings Bank still exists. It was opened in 1850, and you might not know that. And you might not know, its name gives the impression that it's, just a bank that caters to all immigrants. But in fact, it was opened specifically by Irish immigrants for Irish immigrants. And this was it was opened by immigrants who came to America before the famine, had done really well, now saw all the famine immigrants coming and arriving in such poor shape and without much money. And they wanted to create a way to encourage the famine immigrants to save. because saving money was so important in America, especially, if you were back in Ireland and, you got sick and you couldn't work, you had tons of relatives there with you who could help support you. But if you emigrated to America, you might not have any relatives with you. And that really made it important to save. But back in the 1850s, there was no deposit insurance, right? Today, we can put our money in the bank and know that even if the bank fails, even if the people who run the bank are criminals, the federal government guarantees we will get our first, I forget what it is now, $250,000 back. But there was no such thing in those days, and banks went bankrupt all the time. So that's the reason that the Irish immigrants opened the Immigrant Savings Bank. They said, we're going to open a bank just for you. And because we are Irish immigrants like you, we promise we will run this bank in a way that the money that you deposit is invested in only the very, very safest investments. And what they did was the only thing they would invest the money in was New York real estate. And as a result, Irish immigrants felt comfortable putting their money in the bank, even if they only had a tiny little amount to deposit. Now, that alone wouldn't have helped me track thousands of Irish immigrants and come up with the story I'm telling you. The reason I can do that is because of the stuff here on the right of the screen. The book that you see here is called the bank's test book. It was called the test book because, think about it, 1850, there's no government-issued ID of any kind. So if you go to the bank and say, if you look at the guy here at the bottom of the screen, I'm Peter Lynch, give me my money, there was no way for the bank to prove that you weren't Peter Lynch. But that's why what the bank did to prevent fraud was they took down all this information you can see here in their test book. And it's called the test book because they used the information here to test your identity, to see if you were really who you said you were. So here's blown up. This is a blow up of what it says. So for Peter Lynch here, it says he is a native of Rahood, 6 miles from Kells County. Now it says Westmeath, but it's really Meath, Ireland. Is in the United States 5 years next Christmas, per the ship CSEA from Liverpool. His father is dead, was named Philip. His mother, Catherine Ryan, is still alive. He has one brother in New York named James, and he has 5 sisters. And we can't see it here because some of this stuff that Zoom is putting in, but his sisters are Anne, Jane, Mary, Ellen, and the 5th one is covered over. He's married to a Mary McFadden, and he has no children. So the bank would use this. If you went to the bank and said, I'm Peter Lynch, give me my money, they would go to the test book, they would find your entry, and then they would say, okay, if you're really Peter Lynch, what's your mother's maiden name? The Immigrant Savings Bank is actually the first business we know of that used mother's maiden name as a security question. But they might also say, okay, how many sisters do you have? And where are they living? And is your father alive or dead? And so forth. What was the name of the ship you came on to America? And they'd use all these questions to make sure you were really who you said you were. And the reason that's important is because, and here's an image of people at the bank where they would have been asking these questions. The reason that that's, and this picture is from about 1880, so the clothes they're wearing aren't quite the same they would have been wearing during the famine era, but the bank inside looked exactly like this in the 1850s. So the reason all this information is important is because, today you can go on something like Ancestry.com and you can see, you can search for Peter Lynches in the United States. And you'd see that there are well over 100 Peter Lynches in the United States, 100 who were born in Ireland, and even dozens who were about the right age as the Peter Lynch who opened the account at the Immigrant Bank in the 1850s. So it would have been impossible before recently, before the opening of the Immigrant Bank records, to know what happened to Peter Lynch. There are 5 different Peter Lynches of about the right age, living in New York. You can't tell which Peter Lynch, if you have the right Peter Lynch, when you look at this one. And you might say, well, look at only the ones married to Marys, but lots of them are married to Marys. And you'd say, all right, well, only look at the ones who have no children, but maybe they had children later. And then also people are dying all the time at this point. So his wife might die and he might remarry and marry somebody else. So it'd be impossible to tell. But with the Immigrant Savings Bank, you can track people. And so I was able to track this Peter Lynch to, of all places, Faxon, Minnesota. And the way I was able to do this, it was quite serendipitous almost, because I had pretty much given up, and then Ancestry.com added the 1885 Minnesota census. And I found that in the 1885 Minnesota census, here's Peter Lynch, and he's living with an Ann Lynch, a Jane Lynch, a Mary Lynch, a James Lynch, and an Ellen Lynch. So not only is the one brother's name correct, and the sibling and the sister's names are correct. Oh, that's right. There's 5 total siblings, 4 sisters, but the names are even given in the same order: Anne, Jane, Mary, Ellen, Anne, Jane, Mary, Ellen. So I thought, that seems pretty interesting that the siblings are named in that order. Let's see what else I can find. And I went to another website, findagrave.com, and I found here's Peter Lynch, native of Rahoud, County Meath. His wife was Mary. And you might say, well, maybe there are lots of Peter Lynches from Rahoud. But I went and looked. Rahoud had a population of 90 people before he left. And then I was able to find other information besides that proved this was the right Peter Lynch. So in that way, I was able to show that Peter Lynch, who came from there and worked for his first decade in America, in New York, as a day laborer at a sugar refinery on the Hudson River, it took his $500 or so of savings, moved to Minnesota, bought a farm there, and was a farmer for the rest of his life. And so that process, several thousand times over, enabled me to kind of paint a new picture of the Famine Irish and show that they actually did much better in America than historians had previously realized. So one of the things you have to know in order to see how the Irish do in America is to know what they did when they first got to America. And it turns out that's a really hard thing to figure out, and historians hadn't been able to do that before. But with the Immigrant Savings Bank records, you're able to do that because it says when they open an account how long they've been in America. So if you take just the people who opened accounts within a year of their arriving in America, what you find is something really interesting. So our stereotype of the Irish famine immigrants was that all the men had to become day laborers and stuff like that because of all the things I talked about before: the lack of capital, the lack of education, the lack of job training. But it turns out when you look, and what I did, what I found was only about half the famine immigrants, when they arrived in America, actually started working at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder as day laborers and so forth, waiters, porters, things like that. And the other half had jobs further up the socioeconomic hierarchies. This is my socioeconomic hierarchy: unskilled at the bottom, then peddlers, then artisans, then clerks and teachers, then business owners, and then doctors and lawyers at the top. So only about half, when they get here, start out in this unskilled position. And at first I thought, this can't be right. Maybe the bank records are very skewed. So then there's another way you can do this. You can go to New York's 1855 census, which lists how long people have been in New York. And you find about the same thing, that the recently arrived Irish immigrants are working in jobs at about the same proportion as the bank's depositors. And so one thing that tells us, which historians hadn't really realized, even though people in Ireland were saying it at the time, is that it's not just a random sample of people who are leaving Ireland during the famine. And in particular, it's not the poorest people leaving Ireland during the famine, because they couldn't afford to leave, right? Because to come to America, you had to travel to a port. There were no regularly scheduled ships. You would buy a ticket on a ship, and the ship didn't leave until the owner decided they had enough cargo to make it worthwhile. And the owner might say, oh, we're going to leave really in the next day or two, but then they might not leave for a week or two. So in order to emigrate, you had to have enough money to be able to pay to support yourself before the ship left. And you had to be able to pay for food to bring with you on the ship, because the ships didn't feed you enough food to really survive. They gave you 1 cup of flour or cornmeal per day. That was all you got, plus some water to mix it with. And they put some cooking stoves out so you could make yourself basically a pancake each day. And that was it. And so you had to bring food on the ship. And as a result, it's not the poorest people who are leaving, but kind of the Irish middle to lower middle class who are leaving Ireland during the famine. And historians hadn't really realized that, even though you look at the press in Ireland and it's saying that constantly. So what I want to do with my last 20 minutes here is just look at the socioeconomic ladder and what the Famine Irish did and how they were able to, and to what extent they moved up it. So as we talked about, the bottom of the ladder are the day laborers. Those are people primarily working on construction sites. New York City is one big construction site at this time because the city's economy is expanding rapidly and because so many immigrants are coming to America at this point. I mean, you think about it today. Today, about a third of New York City's population, just above a third, is foreign born. 38% is foreign born these days. But in this period, more than half of New York City's population was foreign born. So the city is teeming with immigrants, and the city is constantly building new tenements to house those immigrants. And so the Irish were able to get lots of jobs on construction sites that way. But there are other jobs they could get. You could work, as I mentioned before, in a gas plant, right? The gas, right? Today, the gas we burn in our homes is natural gas that comes out of the ground. But back then, they manufactured the gas by burning coal. And the Irish who worked in the coal plants are interesting because they show how important networking was for immigrants getting jobs. What I was able to do with the immigrant savings bank records is make a database. I listed all the immigrants, their names in one column, their occupations in another column, exactly where they came from in Ireland in another column. And then when you sort it by place of birth, what I found, for instance, was that almost all the Irish immigrants who worked at the big gas plant that was at the corner of First Avenue and 21st Street and took up an entire city block, almost all the Irish immigrants who worked there came from one little tiny town in Ireland in northern County Kerry, Castle Gregory, up here. If you've been on the Ring of Kerry, you've gone through Castle Gregory. It's only got 500 people in it today, and it only had 500 people back then. And so when you came to New York from Castle Gregory, and the first thing you do is find some other people from Castle Gregory, and you say, I need a job. Can you help me? And they say, sure, come work at the gas plant. We always need new people. And that was how people got jobs, including jobs like this. Now, some unskilled work paid more than others. So working at a construction site typically paid $1 a day back in those periods, anywhere from, depending on how the economy is going, 88.5 cents to $1 a day. But other jobs paid more. And one of those unskilled jobs you could do without any training at all was being a porter. And a porter's job paid more if you hustled, right? So how much money you made as a porter depended on how early you got, say, to the docks or the railroad station in the morning, how fast you worked so you could get back there and get another customer, how long a day you worked, how many days a week you worked. And the way we know that porters earned more than day laborers is because of the bank records. And so you can use, again, using my database and looking at the deposits and withdrawals and the account balances, you see that porters saved on average 25% more in their accounts than day laborers. And so that's how we know that these kinds of jobs paid more. And then if you saved enough money as a porter, you could become a cartman. You could buy or rent a horse and cart. And basically a cartman was a porter who had help carrying his stuff from the cart and the horse. And we know that cartmen saved on average 50% more than day laborers. And so that was the reason if you were a porter, you might try to save enough money to become a cartman. So looking at, as I said, thousands of famine immigrants and seeing how they did over the course of their lives, looking at the people who started in New York as unskilled workers. And so we saw that's half the male famine immigrants. What we find is 59% of them stay unskilled workers their whole lives. And the other 41% move up the socioeconomic ladder. Here's my very rudimentary image of a ladder. 41% move up the ladder. Some move only up as far as peddlers, and I'll talk in a second about why that's a higher rung. And some move to become skilled workers like carpenters and so forth. But what's interesting is the most popular thing to move up to from unskilled worker was business owners. So like John Lane, who became a saloon keeper. And in fact, saloon keeping was the most common thing that an unskilled worker moved to. Saloon keeping was the most common. Running a small grocery was the second most common. But that accounts for only about a third of all the businesses that the Famine Irish opened. The others, well, we'll talk about those in a couple of minutes. Now, I mentioned peddlers are the next rung up the ladder, and you might say, why would that be? Look at the conditions these guys are in. This guy's out selling umbrellas in the rain. What a terrible job that must be. This guy's roaming the streets for hours and hours and hours each day, hoping to sell a tattered old hat and maybe make a few cents. So that's what historians have always thought about peddlers, that peddling must be a job of last resort, the kind of thing you only do when there's nothing else you can find. But the immigrant savings bank records prove that, at least for the Famine Irish in New York, that is not the case. The peddlers who had accounts at the immigrant savings bank saved more than almost every other kind of famine immigrant. The only people who saved more money in their accounts than peddlers were doctors, lawyers, and saloon keepers. Every other group, the peddlers outsaved. And there's lots of reasons for this. One is that peddling is more lucrative than we might have imagined. Certainly during the famine era, it was. A second thing is that the peddlers didn't stay peddlers forever. So what I'm talking about here when I say peddlers saved more than every other group, I'm talking about people who started out as peddlers when they opened their immigrant savings bank accounts. So about half the people who were peddlers when they started out with their bank accounts in New York actually rose up the ladder and became owners of brick and mortar stores. But even the peddlers who stayed peddlers their whole careers in New York saved more than virtually every other kind of famine immigrant. So it turns out we've been underestimating the money-making possibilities of peddling. And of course, the peddlers made most of their money peddling to other immigrants. Right? If you were a native-born New Yorker, you wouldn't be very likely. You might, in a rainstorm, buy an umbrella from one of these people. But otherwise, peddlers made most of their money selling in immigrant neighborhoods to other immigrants, not to native-born Americans. There's networking even in peddling. So you'll see here on the screen, this is Northern Ireland, County Tyrone, and here's the parish called Bodoni Lower. When again, I took my database and I sorted it by occupation and looked only at charcoal peddlers. And then I looked at where the charcoal peddlers in New York were from. The vast majority of the charcoal peddlers in New York City in the 1850s were from County Tyrone and only County Tyrone. And then the vast 3/4 of the peddlers from County Tyrone were from this one parish, Bodoni Lower. Which I found, which is another example of networking. You come to New York from there, you say, I need a job, can you help me? And you say, sure, I'll show you the ropes of how you peddle charcoal. You can start out driving my cart. And then later on, once you learn the ropes, you can go get your own cart, but you got to peddle it someplace else and not compete with me. And so this is another example of immigrant networking in terms of occupations. Now, continuing to move up the ladder, we get to artisans. So that's, as you can see here from this great image from the New York Historical Society, we're talking about painters, carpenters, printers, shoemakers, tailors, things like that. And as we saw, about a third of the famine immigrant men who arrive in New York are working immediately upon their arrival as artisans of one kind or another, which shows that they had been trained in these things before they got to America. And that's instructive because if you look at the total population of Ireland, not the percentage of men who are working that are artisans in Ireland is much, much lower than a third. So that shows that artisans are emigrating in disproportionate numbers. Now, the number one artisanal job for Irish famine immigrants in New York was being a tailor. Because of course everybody needs clothes. And at first, if you come to New York and you're an Irish trained tailor, you're going to work typically for a clothing manufacturer. So you might make clothes for Brooks Brothers, which already existed by that point, or some other clothing retailer. But eventually, you might decide to go out on your own and open your own clothing retail establishment. That's what George Fox did here. If you look at this ad that George Fox ran in a newspaper in the 1850s, he was an Irish immigrant, also from Tyrone. He starts out in New York working as a journeyman tailor, that is, working for wages for a clothing manufacturer. But he eventually opens his own store. As you can see here, he calls it the New York Bazaar Fashionable Tailoring Establishment. So I love George Fox because most clothing retailers who ran ads in newspapers ran little teeny tiny ads that, offering their wares and listing their location. But George Fox believed in huge splashy ads like this one, bragging about his, in this case, his prices here. When he found that, all right, I can make decent money bragging about my low prices and being located. This was when he was located kind of adjacent to the Five Points neighborhood on Broadway, near the corner of what's now Worth Street. But he realized he'd make more money if he could sell to more wealthy people at a higher markup. And so what he did was he went to Washington, which is where I am. I'm down here in Arlington, Virginia right now. He went to Washington, he opened a pop-up shop at the Willard Hotel. And then he went to Capitol Hill and he went around the halls of Congress and he went to famous congressmen and senators and so forth. And he said, you know what? He said, I'm so sure you're going to love my clothing that I will make you a suit for free just to show you how good they are. And you can have it for free. And then if you want more, you can have more or not. I don't care. And so lots of, congressmen love free things. Do we know that? Yes, we do. So lots of congressmen took him up on this. And then he went back to New York and advertised, this senator, this ambassador wear George Fox clothes. Shouldn't you too? And he starts making fancier suits for fancier people. And he has a thriving business in New York until he dies in the 1870s. Now, exactly how thriving it is, it's hard to tell because he was, a big braggart. And so it's hard to know for sure. But he did own a tenement that he rented out. And so we know he had done at least fairly well. Now, not every Irish artisan came to New York already knowing their trade. Some learned trades in New York. And one of those was Morocco dressing. Morocco dressing was what the term that was used in this period to describe fake leather made from goat hides. And you might say, well, why would you make leather from a goat when you could make it from a cow? Well, goat hides were cheaper. And so if you were selling cheap books or cheap furniture, you would manufacture it with Morocco leather, quote unquote, instead of real leather. And so this trade became dominated in the 1850s by Irish immigrants who taught it to other more recently arrived Irish immigrants. Here are some pictures of Morocco dressing. You're using this tool here to slice all the goat hairs off of the hide. Then you would take the hide and you would make it into a balloon and you'd blow it up, and then you floated it in this sumac solution, and that was how you tanned it, and then you sold it to book binders and furniture makers and so forth. And again, there's lots of networking involved in this. Most of the Irish immigrants in New York who work at Morocco dressing come from one particular parish in County Donegal. Again, and there's no Morocco dressing in Ireland at all. So this is not something they came with. This is something they learned in New York and then passed on to other Irish immigrants. Now, moving the next step up the ladder, we get to the white collar part of the socioeconomic ladder. Those are clerical and civil service jobs. So you can see that this is the records of the Immigrant Savings Bank again, and you have lots of Irish immigrants who have those jobs. Here's Tom O'Farrell, he's a clerk. Here's John Holton, he's an Irish clerk. Here's John Daly, another Irishman, he's a clerk. So lots of clerks. Now, are there as many Irish clerks as Irish day laborers? Of course not. But about 10% of the Irish famine immigrant men working in New York worked at clerical jobs of one kind or another. And I'll just mention two stories of these. One is Hubert Glynn. I love his story. He goes to college in Ireland for a year before deciding to come to America. So he's very well educated, much more educated than the typical Irish immigrant. And so he comes to America and he tries to get a job as a clerk because he's got good handwriting. And in those days, keep in mind, a clerk's main job is writing stuff and copying stuff. And he eventually gets a job with the Irish Immigrant Society, the same group that started the Immigrant Savings Bank. That was a group that helped Irish immigrants once they got to America. He gets a job with them in part because of his good handwriting and in part because he spoke Irish. And a lot of the famine immigrants didn't speak English. They spoke only Irish. So he gets that job. When New York at the end of 1854 decides that it can no longer just have immigrants land willy-nilly at any old pier along the Hudson or East River, that the immigrants all ought to land in one place and clerks ought to write down information about them when they arrive, so there was some uniform record of them. They decide to do that at the end of 1854, and they hire Hubert Glynn to be their chief clerk, the one who's in charge of all the lower level clerks they will hire to get information from every immigrant who lands there. And Glynn has this job for over 30 years, from when Castle Garden opens in 1854 until his retirement 30 years later. By the time he retires, he owns his own home in South Brooklyn, and has done, quite well for himself in that sense. Another way you could become a white-collar worker was through who you knew rather than your skills. James Kavanagh was a carpenter, came from Ireland in the early 1850s, worked as a carpenter, but also volunteered in what then was called the state militia, which would be the equivalent today of the National Guard. And so like the National Guard today, with the state militia, you promised that you would, once every month, 1 weekend a month, you would go and train with your militia unit. As you can see here, Kavanagh was with the 69th Militia Regiment, which was a all-Irish militia regiment for the state of New York. And so you did that, and the idea was, and you got paid a little bit, and the idea was if America was ever invaded, you would defend the country. So people hadn't thought that, if the country is not invaded, but in fact tears apart and enters a civil war, that you'd be called to that too. But when the Civil War starts, the militia units are called to Washington to serve in the army, and Kavanagh does that. And he's become an officer in the militia unit. And he doesn't have the same training as an officer would who went to West Point, but that was how these militia units worked. So he becomes a colonel as a result of his training with these troops in New York on weekends, and he fights at all the major bloodiest Civil War battles at Antietam, at Fredericksburg, and so forth. He's wounded very badly at Fredericksburg. After that, he's sent back home and spends the rest of the war recuperating in New York. But he's not doing very well. The pay in the army was terrible. He didn't have much money saved from being a carpenter. I mean, he was doing so badly that his wife had to hire herself out as a wet nurse after he got home wounded from the army in 1864. When he recuperates, he goes back to work as a carpenter. He tries several times to do what carpenters do when they try to move up the ladder and tries to become a builder, but he doesn't succeed at that. So he has to go back to working for wages as a carpenter. So by the 1880s, when he's getting kind of old and kind of infirm and doing the heavy work that carpenters did was becoming hard for him, his friends went to New York City's politicians and said, look, we should do something for Kavanaugh. He was a hero of Antietam. He was a hero of Fredericksburg. He shouldn't be slaving away as a carpenter when he's a hero of the country. And so using their connections, they got Kavanaugh a job at the Custom House in Brooklyn, supervising the clerks and inspectors who evaluated the imports and decided what tariffs would be levied on them. And so that was another way that you could become a white-collar worker, not through any education, because Kavanaugh didn't have that, but instead through favors and so forth. And in the book, I talk about lots of cases like that. So the final rung of the ladder, for all intents and purposes, for a famine immigrant was business owner, right? I mentioned how there's doctors and lawyers, the highest rung, but it was really, really hard for a famine immigrant to get to that level. There are some, and I talk about them in the book, but for this talk, we'll stop at the next to the highest rung, business owners. As I mentioned before, the most common business a famine immigrant would open would be a saloon. Here's the saloon of one famine immigrant in 5 Points on Pearl Street, in that very same location that, again, now the Moynihan Courthouse sits on. And this image makes the saloon seem much bigger than it really was. So this saloon would have been in a tenement, and it's quite likely that this room would have only been 15 feet wide and 25 feet deep. So it's a very small space. The image in Harper's Weekly is kind of used as a wide angle lens in effect. And by the way, these are targets that militia units would have used on their weekend training. And so this militia unit probably met in the back room of the saloon, and that's why they put up their best targets and their best bullseyes to kind of show the people who came to the tenement. I talk in the book about quite a few stories of quite a few people who moved up to become saloon keepers. One of my favorites is Bernard Woods, who opened a saloon in Brooklyn, in Williamsburg, and eventually, because so many of his immigrant customers like sports, he bought a neighboring building and turned it into a sports complex, which when the New York Times described it as a miniature Madison Square Garden. And in this place, they had boxing matches, races, the occasional union meeting, and so forth. Then another story I love that I put in here because it took place not quite as high up as the Dyckman farmhouse, but up in the West 160s is the story of this guy named Fenton, who worked for 10 years as a gardener when he first arrived in New York, as a gardener at an orphanage, saved his money and bought a property in the West 160s, so one of the cheapest places you could buy land in New York City in those days, because it was very rural in those days, and opened a saloon. And he lived very modestly his whole life there. When he died, all his possessions in his house were said to be worth only $50. But then his relative said, well, what about that little safe he's got there on that table? We should open that too. And so the court says, yes, we should open the safe. And they open the safe and they discover, as this news account says, that there were bank books and cash and bonds whose value was $114,000, which to translate into modern funds would be, close to $10 million today. All from this man who had hardly any clothes in his house and hardly any furniture either. And that shows, and so Thomas Fenton was an extreme example of something you find all the time with the famine immigrants. They were so traumatized by the famine and the fact that they saw their loved ones starving around them for lack of having saved money to buy food in an emergency that they became obsessive savers when they got to America. And that's one of the things historians hadn't understood. And that's one of the things that explains the famine immigrants doing so well. One last story I'll mention of business owners before I wrap up is another story I love, which kind of shows the same theme, but in a different variation. And that's the Morgan brothers. These three Morgan brothers come to New York in the early 1850s in their teens. Excuse me. At first, they do very typical jobs. One works as a stable boy, mucking out stables. Another works as a day laborer. And they live for a time, they board with some other young men who work making soda at a soda factory. Factory isn't really the right word. Imagine more like a workshop where they made soda. This is the kind of thing that would have been, not much bigger than 1,000 square foot space where you would manufacture soda. And they said, that looks like a good job. And they go to work for the soda maker also. And then after a few years doing that, they're like, we'll sell soda ourselves. Why should we work for penny small wages when we can retail it ourselves? So they move to what's then kind of the outskirts of New York, the West 20s in Manhattan, and start their own soda business and focus on retailing their soda to saloons and restaurants in the West 20s and 30s. And they become quite successful at this. So successful that they take their profits and they buy Manhattan real estate with it. But they don't want to buy the expensive real estate that's downtown. So they buy in what's then the outskirts in the middle of Manhattan in the 40s and 50s, which is cheap then because where people wanted to be was by the rivers, not so much in the middle. Of course, once Central Park is built, then the middle becomes more popular and they become quite wealthy soda manufacturers. And one of the reasons I want to mention them is this is an actual Morgan Brothers soda bottle that I got from a collector. And one of the things you learn from looking at the soda bottle, so you can see this is my hand and the bottle is smaller than my hand. So a serving of soda back then was only 4 or 5 ounces, not the big gulps we have today. But so by the 1870s, the Morgan Brothers are wealthy. But what did they do? Did they rest on their laurels? No. They decide, this business almost runs itself. Why don't we open another business? So they decide to open a moving and storage business, which they also call Morgan Brothers. And they leave 2 of the brothers one of the brothers doing the soda business, and 2 of them start working for the moving and storage business. And soon the storage business is just as profitable as the soda business. And what I love about the Morgan Brothers story is both these businesses still exist today. The Morgan Brothers eventually bought a Minnesota company called White Rock and merged with them. And White Rock soda, at least last time I looked, was still being manufactured in Queens and is the original Morgan Brothers company. And then Morgan Brothers Moving and Storage has become Morgan Manhattan Moving and Storage. And if you Google them, you'll see you can still get them to move you today. So what we find overall is that if we look at where the famine immigrants were when they got to New York, remember this from before, and where they ended up at the end of their careers, by the end of their careers, 1/3 of the famine immigrants are business owners. And only 25% still work as unskilled workers. And so what you find is, in fact, that 45% of the famine immigrants end their lives as in a white-collar occupation of one kind or another. And this is far different than historians had previously imagined. Now, of course, what I'm leaving out here, and this is significant, is I'm leaving out the people who died soon after they arrived. Right? So what we're looking at is only people who lived 10, 20 years or more. And I talk about the people who died in the book as well. But in terms of socioeconomic mobility, really what you want to know is, did people stay where they were or did they rise up the ladder? And in that case, the numbers are clear that the famine immigrants rose up the ladder in a way much more than we would have expected. And in fact, only a quarter of the men who arrive in America and start out in unskilled trades end their lives that way. So that's my story. That's the story of the book. But the book focuses really on the great stories that make up the famine immigration. Um, and I'm happy to answer questions or hear comments now.
Thank you so much. This was really fascinating. I have a couple of questions. Let me see. And also, if you're in the audience and want to submit your questions, please use the Q&A function. So we have a question from one of our interns. Even though many Irish people migrated to the US, specifically New York, did they have a hard time assimilating into the broader culture and life?
Well, so I guess I would phrase the issue differently in the sense that what I found in this book and my previous book, which was a history of immigrant life in New York City called City of Dreams, where I looked at the immigrant life in New York City from the 1600s all the way to the present. And what you find is that people who emigrate to the United States as adults rarely assimilate in the way that native-born Americans think of as assimilation. Right? So native-born Americans say, we want immigrants to assimilate. We want them to talk like us and dress like us and read the same books we read and watch the same TV shows we read and not have accents anymore. In that sense, the answer to the question is yes, they had a hard time because they didn't assimilate that much. And that's been the case for every immigrant group that has ever come to New York. If you come as an adult, for the rest of your life, when you use the word home, you're going to mean not Queens, but the place you were born. And the songs you sing are going to tend to be the songs from your homeland growing up. And the foods you eat are going to tend to be the foods you ate in your homeland growing up. So I wouldn't phrase it, though, as they had a hard time assimilating, and more that assimilation wasn't the most important thing to them, at least not in the terms native-born Americans put it. So to the Irish immigrants, they're very assimilated. And when they go back to Ireland, people say, oh, you're totally different. But in America, they also seem totally different to native-born Americans. And so you end up inhabiting this kind of in-between space where you're not as Irish as the Irish anymore, but you're not as American as the Americans want you to be. So you end up in this very difficult in-between space.
Right. I can imagine moving to, somewhere you're very unfamiliar with, keeping a part of those things from home, right, are very comforting. And
Exactly.
probably surrounding yourself too with other people that are from or having the same experience that you're having. So we have another question. Were there any challenges or uncertainties when researching the bank records?
Sure. So the biggest challenge is what I did was I took the first 18,000 accounts opened at the Immigrant Savings Bank. That was 15,000 individuals. And of them, 12,000 were Irish born. And of those, about 10,000 came during the famine years. So I tried to find all 10,000 people. I was not able to track them all. So the Peter Lynch stories, those are the successes. And there are lots of failures, or where I get part way and then person suddenly disappears and you don't know, are they dead or did they move? And then the biggest challenge though was tracking women, because most of the women who opened immigrant savings bank accounts were single, and most of them would have gotten married and then their name changed and they become really hard to trace. So a lot of the women who and this talk focused on men and upward mobility, but there's lots of women in the book too. I talk about women who are servants, women who are teachers, women who own their own businesses. but the women were hard to trace. And so, especially the women who were domestic servants, because they almost always got married, changed their name, became hard to trace. The women, the domestics who were I found tend to be women who got married, but then had an unmarried sister living with them. And so I could see that there was someone in the family with that last name. And that was how I could figure out that that was, and then the census would say, this is the sister of her. And then I could know, okay, that's her maiden name and so forth. So yeah, tracking women is hard using the method I used.
Yeah. And like Peter Lynch, I think having so many names that are so similar, we have that in our own research here with the Dykeman family. So many of them use the same name that you kind of have to number them to know what generation it is you're talking about. And yeah, it certainly makes it challenging.
Exactly.
Okay, so I have another question. Since unskilled laborers were more likely to be working alongside other Irish immigrants, how did those in higher paying and white collar jobs maintain connection and community with other Irish immigrants, if not in the workplace?
They would do that in their residential neighborhoods. So, as you mentioned, um, the Irish tend to live in Irish neighborhoods in this period. The one exception to that, where we tend to, the Irish are kind of an exception to that. I mean, 5 Points is 90% Irish, so there certainly are Irish neighborhoods, but so many Irish immigrants flee the famine that virtually every neighborhood in New York has more Irish-born adults than people born in the United States or any place else. So I write this in the book. It's something like New York had 22 wards in that period, and I believe 21 of the 22 wards, Irish-born adult men are the biggest population in 21 of those 22 wards. And so all of New York is Irish during the famine. And, you think about it, it's uh, almost about 1 million people flee Ireland, and about 800,000 of them land in New York City. And that's in a city that had 600,000 people. Now, they don't all stay in New York City, but so it's just, we think we have a migrant crisis today, but this is this is a drop in the bucket compared to how the city was changed by the famine immigrants. They were just everywhere and dominated the population.
Yeah, makes sense. This was a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. I hope everyone enjoyed this talk. Please consider making a donation to enable us to continue to offer free public programming at the museum. Gifts in any amount are appreciated, and stay tuned. Follow us on social media for details about our final session of History and Focus that will be happening in June. And I thank you for attending and hope that you all have a great rest of your day. And thank you so much, Dr. Anbinder. This was really interesting. And I can't wait to read more. And I've already got a couple of rabbit holes of research to go down.
Great.
All right. Thank you
Thank you
so
so much.
much. All righty.